There is a list in the British Museum that breaks in the middle of a sentence. It's called the Sumerian King List. For most of it, nothing strange happens. Name after name, reign after reign. Kingship passed down city to city without a single gap. Then one line stops everything. The flood swept over. Not a war, not a famine. No explanation at all, just the line, and then kingship descended again from heaven, as if someone hit reset on the whole record. I keep returning to that hinge. What survived the gap it leaves open? Final review, look at the list again, slowly this time. Look past the line everyone quotes. The rupture isn't really one line, it's a seam stitching together two completely different kinds of record as if nothing happened. Before the seam, the document reads like an accountant's ledger for eternity. A Lulim of Eridu reigns for 28,800 years. A Laungar follows him for 36,000. Kings move from Eridu to Bad-tibira, to Larak to Sippar to Shuruppak, 8 rulers in total, across 5 cities, each tallying reigns longer than recorded civilization itself. Add the numbers up and the antediluvian total runs past 200,000 years, recorded with the same flat confidence as tax roll. The scribes don't blink at the numbers. They write them the way they'd write a grain tax. Flatly, factually, as administrative detail. This isn't poetry pretending to be history, it's bookkeeping, pretending nothing strange is being recorded at all. The clearest surviving copy of this part of the list is carved into the Weld-Blundell prism, a 4-sided clay column sitting in the Ashmolean Museum, inscribed around 1800 BCE, by a scribe copying material that was already old when he wrote it. Centuries later, the Babylonian priest Berossus summarized a version of the same antediluvian kings for a Greek audience, writing in a different language for a completely different empire. His numbers run just as long, just as flatly impossible, just as confidently recorded. 2 scribal traditions, 1,000 years and a language apart, agreeing on the same shape, an unbroken line before something, and a very different world after. Then, at Shuruppak, the ledger produces a name that doesn't belong with the others, Ziusudra. Not a god. Not a hero in the way Gilgamesh is a hero, larger than life and half divine. Just the last king before the line breaks, the final entry before the document stops behaving like a ledger and starts behaving like a confession. Later flood narratives layered on top of this list centuries afterward single him out as the one who survived what came next. The king list barely mentions him. But its placement is the detail worth sitting with. The flood doesn't arrive randomly in the text. It arrives exactly where the before people end, and someone has to be left standing to start the after people moving again. Here's the structural problem nobody quite explains. A king list by definition exists to prove continuity. This ruler to that ruler, this city's authority handed to the next, an unbroken chain of legitimacy stretching backward to justify whoever holds power when the scribe is writing. That's the entire genre's purpose in nearly every culture that ever produced one. It has no use for an ending, no use for an interruption, and yet, in the middle of a chain built specifically to deny that anything ever truly ends, the scribes stop. They write that the flood swept over the land. Then, without explanation, they resume, kingship descended again from heaven, this time to Kish. Why include the break at all, in a document whose only job is to look unbroken? A propaganda document, and the king list is one built to justify whichever city held power when the scribe sat down to write, shouldn't want a total discontinuity on the page. A clean lie would skip it entirely, sliding from Shuruppak's kings to Kish's kings as if the chain had never been touched. Instead, the scribes recorded the snap. They marked, in their own continuity-obsessed document, the one moment continuity failed. Not an oversight, an admission, embedded inside a genre built to never admit anything. So something happened between before and after that the scribes couldn't fully erase, not even in a document whose entire job was erasure by omission. Something, or someone, had to exist in that gap, in the space the list itself refuses to describe, for kingship to have anywhere to descend again to, once it ended. This is where the investigation actually starts, not the flood itself, argued over for 2 centuries already, but the gap. If kingship survived the break, it survived somewhere. The text gives no coordinates, only a structural certainty, a before and after, a seam. So the question turns geographic as much as historical. Where does a civilization put what it needs to keep, when it can no longer trust the ground to keep it for it. 3 kinds of answers keep surfacing across the flood traditions that grew up around this list, and across the older material some of them seem to be drawing from. 1 points upward, to height, to the places water cannot easily reach, the oldest and most universal answer a flood story can give. 1 points downward and inward, to things deliberately put underground, sealed, built over, hidden from view rather than simply lost. 1 points outside the map altogether, to sacred geography that no longer corresponds to any place we can locate, as if the name survived but the coordinates didn't. None of these 3 is the whole answer. That took me longest to accept. They don't compete, they accumulate, each covering a kind of survival the others can't. A mountain explains how people might live through rising water, day after day, while everything below them disappears. It doesn't explain why a temple would be buried on purpose, stone by the very people who built it. A hidden temple explains deliberate concealment. It doesn't explain a sacred map that simply stops matching the ground beneath it. Something that survives a flood needs height. Something that survives deliberate erasure needs concealment. Something that survives centuries of retelling needs to slip outside the record entirely. 3 different threats. 3 different shelters. The list doesn't name any of these places. It can't. That's not what king lists do. But it leaves the gap they have to fill, and gaps, unlike lists, invite you to go looking. Start with the one every flood tradition reaches for first, the one carved into nearly every survival myth from this region outward. Up. Before the buried sanctuaries, before the lost geography, there is the mountain, the place water supposedly could not climb, and the place where the oldest versions of this story insist a handful of people came down again, carrying whatever they'd managed to keep. Start with the boat. Every later flood story does. The most detailed surviving account of what happened in this gap isn't the King List. It's Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood hero, here called Utnapishtim, describes the water in language that still reads like a man trying to explain something his listeners have no framework for. 6 long days and 6 nights the wind blew, he says, flood and tempest, overwhelming the land. On the 7th day the storm subsided, and the sea grew calm, and he looked out and saw nothing, no land, only the surface of the water, flat and silent, with the bodies of the dead floating on it like driftwood. That image keeps surfacing. The flatness, the silence after, the absence of any horizon to navigate by. It shows up across versions of this story written centuries apart in different cities by scribes who likely never read each other's work. And then, in the text, there is a mountain. Utnapishtim's boat grounds on Mount Nisir. He waits there 7 days before sending out a dove, then a swallow, then a raven, testing whether anywhere had dried out enough to stand on. Sit with how specific that detail is. Not a generic high ground, a named peak, with a name a scribe expected listeners to recognize. Later traditions move the landing site around, attach it to different peaks as the story migrates through different cultures and centuries, the way oral material tends to relocate itself to whatever mountain a given audience already considers sacred. But the function never changes. The boat needs height. The survivors need height. Whatever they're carrying with them, people, animals, the knowledge to start everything again, needs somewhere the water provably did not reach. This is where Ziusudra rejoins the story. The King List gave him almost nothing, a name, a placement, a silence. The fuller narratives fill that silence in. A king warned in advance, told to build something that could float, told to bring more than just his own family aboard. Whether you read that as myth, memory, or both, the structural role is identical to Utnapishtim's. Someone has to be warned, someone has to build, someone has to land somewhere specific enough that the story bothers naming it. A flood narrative without a landing point isn't a survival story. It's just a drowning, with the ending left out. Now the part researchers actually argue about, and the part worth being careful with. In the 1990s, marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed that the Black Sea underwent a sudden, catastrophic flooding event roughly 7,500 years ago, when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosphorus and poured into what had been a smaller freshwater lake, expanding it dramatically within a relatively short window. The hypothesis was controversial the moment it was published, and it stays controversial. Some sediment studies support a rapid event. Others argue the rise was far more gradual than Ryan and Pittman's original model suggested. Never proven, never closed. There's an older, more physical piece of evidence that gets less attention than it probably deserves. In the 1920s, archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated down through the ruins of Ur and hit something unexpected. A thick, clean layer of water-laid clay, more than 2 meters deep, sitting directly between two distinct phases of human occupation. Pottery and architecture of one style below it, a completely different style above. Woolley announced, with more confidence than the evidence strictly supported, that he'd found physical proof of the flood. Later, archaeologists were more careful. Similar flood deposits show up at several Mesopotamian sites, at different depths and dates, suggesting repeated local flooding across centuries, not one global event captured in a single layer of mud. That correction matters, and it's worth being honest about it. But it doesn't erase the original observation entirely. Somewhere in nearly every old city along these rivers, there's a layer of clay separating one world from another, close to where the King List scribes placed their own seam, give or take a few centuries either direction. What the Black Sea hypothesis offers, regardless of where you land on it, is a plausible regional mechanism. A population living near a freshwater coastline, watching that coastline vanish within living memory, retreating uphill as the water kept climbing past where it was supposed to stop. It doesn't prove the Sumerian flood tradition. It doesn't connect in any peer-reviewed sense to Shuruppak or to Ziusudra by name. What it offers is more modest, and I'd argue more useful. Evidence that sudden, regionally catastrophic flooding is not just possible, but documented in the broader geological record of exactly the part of the world this story comes from. The myth doesn't need to be literally true in every detail for the underlying fear to be real. People in this region had reason, at some point, to watch water rise faster than they expected, and to remember which direction was up, so the first zone holds, even after all the caveats. Height functions as shelter in the oldest layer of the story, in the geology some researchers think underlies it, and in nearly every flood tradition descended from or alongside it. If you only needed an answer to how anyone survived the water, the mountain answers it completely. People climbed. Some of them stayed alive long enough to climb back down. But height was never the only thing this investigation kept circling back to, and it isn't the only kind of survival the wider tradition insists on. A mountain explains bodies staying alive. It does nothing to explain what happens to the things those bodies built, the temples, the sanctuaries, the physical record of a city's relationship to its own gods. Once the water recedes and the people who survived have to decide what to do with what's left standing, or what's left buried under silt that never quite gets cleared away. Across this same region, archaeologists keep finding temple foundations that weren't simply abandoned or lost to time. They were filled in, sealed, built over deliberately by people who clearly still knew exactly where the older structure was. A different kind of survival than climbing a mountain, and a much harder one to explain away as accident or ordinary neglect. Sealing a temple wasn't an act of careless neglect in this region. For a long stretch of Mesopotamian history, it was standard, expected, practice. When a sanctuary's mud brick walls finally degraded past any hope of repair, builders didn't clear the site down to bare ground and start fresh. They filled the old structure's interior with packed rubble and clean fill, levelled it, and built the new temple directly on top, often on the exact same footprint, oriented the exact same way, sometimes even reusing the same foundation deposits buried in the corners. The new walls rose directly on the bones of the old ones, layer stacked precisely on layer, century after century. At Eridu, archaeologists have traced this layering down through more than a dozen successive temples dedicated to the god Enki, each one buried under the next, stretching back to what may be the oldest religious structure yet excavated anywhere in Mesopotamia. A small shrine barely larger than a single room, sitting at the very bottom of the entire stack, with 17 separate rebuildings recorded directly above it, before the city's history even reaches the periods historians consider well documented. Eridu's own mythology called it the first city, the place kingship existed before it ever descended anywhere else in the world. Its temple complex is physically a stack of deliberately buried sanctuaries, one inside the next, a sequence of sealed rooms nobody ever fully emptied. Buried and lost are not the same verb. That's the whole point. A lost temple implies abandonment. People leaving, forgetting, the desert or the silt doing the rest of the work without anyone's help, decades or centuries passing before anyone thinks to dig there again. A buried temple, in this tradition, implies the opposite, continuous attention. Someone had to know exactly where the old sanctuary's walls stood in order to build squarely on top of them centuries later, down to the orientation, down to the placement of the inner shrine. The act of sealing it preserved its location even as it removed it entirely from view. Whatever this practice was protecting, sacred ground, ritual continuity, or something more specific the texts never spell out, it was being protected on purpose, generation after generation, by people who never stopped knowing exactly where to dig. Now the second piece, which is less about what's underground, far more, instead, about what's missing from the map entirely. Sumerian and later Mesopotamian texts describe a place called Dilmun, a pure, clean land, described in the Sumerian poem Enki and Ninhursag as a place without sickness, without old age, without the ordinary suffering of human life, and elsewhere associated with the dwelling place of the gods, with eternal life, with the location where Ziusudra is granted immortality after the flood and taken to live apart from ordinary humanity. Scholars have spent the better part of a century trying to pin Dilman to an actual coordinate. The Assyriologist Samuel Kramer, among others, argued for decades that the text placed it somewhere in the Persian Gulf, and the leading candidate since has been the island of Bahrain and the nearby coast of eastern Arabia, supported by trade good finds and inscriptions referencing Dilman as a real trading partner. Other researchers have argued for Failaka Island, or for shifting locations across different periods, since the name appears to migrate depending on which century's text you're reading. None of these proposals is universally accepted. It's an open, ongoing argument in Assyriology, decades old, with serious scholars on more than one side of it. What's strange isn't that Dilman's location is debated. Plenty of ancient place names get debated. What's strange is the shape of the disagreement. Dilmun behaves, in the texts, like a real, tradable, visitable place. Ships sail there, goods come from there, merchants reference it in ordinary commercial inscriptions the way they'd reference any port on the Gulf. And yet it also behaves like the explicit landing place for the flood's most famous survivor after his story ends. A paradise reserved for one man and however many companions he kept. A real genuine trade destination and a mythic paradise-like afterlife destination, layered onto the same single name, in the same corpus, written by the same scribble culture that gave us the King List's seam. Either the sacred geography drifted loose from the physical geography over centuries of retelling, or the physical Dilman was always standing in for something the texts weren't fully willing to locate for just anyone reading them. Here is where the three threads finally meet, all at once. One civilization, one broken King List, three completely different strategies for getting something through whatever happened at that seam. Survival by careful elevation, the mountain, the boat, the named peak water couldn't reach. Survival by concealment, temples deliberately buried under their own successors, location preserved, visibility removed, the knowledge passed down through builders rather than scribes. Survival by displacement, a sacred geography that drifted off the actual map, landing on a place name everyone in the ancient world apparently recognized, but that nobody today can point to with full certainty. Three zones, clearly. Not three competing theories about one flood, each cancelling the others out. One pattern, repeating across every kind of evidence this culture left behind. When something needed to survive, this civilization's answer was never simply to remember it out loud. The answer was to put it somewhere, up, under, or just outside the reach of an ordinary map, and trust the location itself, not the telling, to do the remembering. A pattern like that doesn't stay satisfied with mountains and missing islands forever. If a civilization repeatedly built shelter for what mattered most, in three different directions at once, then somewhere there should be a structure old enough to have existed before any of this was ever written down at all. Predating the King List, predating Gilgamesh, predating even the earliest version of Ziusudra's name, and yet still standing. Not buried under speculation, under actual excavated stone, in a place researchers have already dated and already walked into with their own hands. Not a myth pointing at a mountain. Not a tablet pointing at an island nobody can agree on. Something physical, something we don't have to imagine, argue about, or take anyone's word for. The structure sits on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, near the modern city of Şanlıurfa. It was nearly bulldozed flat before anyone fully understood what they were even looking at. German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating there in 1995 after a brief 1960s survey had dismissed the hill's scattered stones as an abandoned medieval cemetery and moved on. What Schmidt found instead were rings of massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some over 5 meters tall and weighing many tons, carved in relief with foxes, boars, vultures, scorpions and snakes, arranged in deliberate circles around larger central stones, shaped unmistakably like stylized human figures, arms and hands carved in low relief along their sides. Radiocarbon dating placed the oldest layers at roughly 9,600 BCE, meaning this site was already finished and in active use over 6,000 years before the Sumerian King List's first scribe ever pressed a reed into wet clay. It predates Stonehenge by about 7,000 years. It predates writing itself by close to 6,000. It predates pottery, and by most current evidence, it predates settled agriculture in the immediate region as well, which is the detail that unsettles archaeologists most. The people who quarried, carved and raised these pillars were very likely still hunting and foraging for their food, organising labour on a monumental scale long before anyone assumed that kind of coordination was even possible without farms or cities to support it. Schmidt himself argued, controversially, that the conventional order of human development might need rethinking entirely, that the temple may have come first, and the settled communities that built cities and wrote king lists may have followed, rather than the other way around, as most textbooks still tend to assume. There is no name carved anywhere on the site for who built it, who worshipped there, what language they spoke, or what they called the place. I need to be careful here, because it's easy to overstate. The Sumerian King List does not mention this hill. No surviving tablet says go here, or this is where it survived, or names this place at all. Nothing in the cuneiform record draws a direct line from Shuruppak's broken seam to this specific hilltop. What connects them isn't a citation. It's a shape. The King List gave us a structural certainty without coordinates. Something had to exist before the break, and something had to carry forward after it, somewhere the record itself refused to specify. Göbekli Tepe doesn't answer where that specific civilization's flood survivors went. It does something different, and arguably stranger. It proves, with excavated stone you can put your hand on, that organised, monumental, deliberately symbolic construction existed in this exact region thousands of years before any list, any flood account, any writing system could have recorded it happening. The question the tablet creates, what survived and where, finally has a physical place old enough to even plausibly answer it, whether or not this particular hill turns out to be that exact answer. And then there's the one remaining detail that turns this from an old ruin into the same pattern I've been tracing the entire time. Around 8000 BCE, the people using Göbekli Tepe didn't abandon it the way collapsing settlements usually get abandoned, walls crumbling slowly while nobody's watching and the wind doing the rest. They buried it. Deliberately, methodically, enclosure by enclosure, they filled the stone circles with packed rubble, broken animal bone, flint debris and soil, bearing their own monumental pillars under tons of debris they had to quarry, carry and pack in by hand. No draft animals, no wheels, no metal tools to make any part of the labour easier. Archaeologists still don't fully agree on why. Some read it as ritual closure, a structure's working life ending with proper rites before the doors are sealed for good. Others read it as deliberate preservation, sealing the site rather than letting open-air weather slowly erode the carvings flat over centuries. Either way, the behaviour is unmistakable, and it is the exact same behaviour traced through layer after layer of Eridu's buried temples thousands of years later, half a continent and several millennia downstream. When something mattered enough in this part of the world, the oldest recorded answer was never to leave it standing in the open for ordinary time to handle. The answer was to bury it on purpose, and trust the ground itself to keep what the people building it couldn't keep forever. So look at the whole shape of it now, from start to finish. A king list breaks mid-sentence, admitting a discontinuity its entire genre exists to deny, and leaves a witness named Ziusudra standing exactly at the seam. The fuller flood narrative sent him uphill to a named mountain the water provably couldn't reach, while geologists argue inconclusively over whether a real regional flood sits underneath that memory. The same culture's temples get sealed rather than abandoned, generation after generation, and its paradise gets pinned to an island scholars still can't fully agree on. And 6,000 years before any of that gets written down, on a hilltop in the same general region, people who left no names at all built something monumental enough to survive 10,000 years, then chose, on purpose, to bury it with their own hands, with no tools but stone and patience. Up, under, and outside the map, and older than all three, the oldest shelter of all, built before the people who eventually wrote the question down even existed. I don't think Göbekli Tepe hides a secret tablet confirming any of this, and I'd be sceptical of anyone who tells you it does. I think it's something more unsettling than that, proof that the impulse behind the entire pattern, build something that matters, then put it somewhere the ordinary passage of time can't simply erase it, is older than every single text in this investigation combined, older than cities, older than farming, possibly older than language as we'd recognize it today. The Sumerian scribes didn't invent that impulse when they wrote a flood into their king list. They inherited it, the way you inherit a habit from people whose names you'll never know. Somewhere underneath all three zones, and underneath the hill at Göbekli Tepe, sits the same original instinct. When the world might end, you don't just hope something survives. You choose, carefully, where to put it. And you trust the choosing more than you trust your own memory of why. The list still sits where it always has, the seams still unexplained, kingship still descending again from heaven onto a city whose name we know, but whose reasons we never fully will. There's a coda worth sitting with, even after the seam closes on the page. Göbekli Tepe wasn't the last site to get this treatment, and it likely wasn't the first either, it's simply the oldest one we've found so far, which is a different claim than the oldest one that exists. Excavation in this region is still young relative to how much ground there is to turn over. Çatalhöyük, centuries younger, shows its own pattern of deliberate infill between building phases. Navali Chori, contemporary with Göbekli Tepe and only a short distance away, was burying its own carved pillars before being submerged under a modern dam reservoir. A second flood. Ironically, this one engineered rather than mythic, closing over a site that had survived the first kind of erasure, only to meet a wholly different one. That detail shouldn't be tidy. It isn't a metaphor arranging itself for convenience. It's just what happens when a region keeps building on water that keeps deciding to come back. Whatever instinct buried the temples and named the mountains didn't end with the Bronze Age. It just changed instruments. The ground still keeps secrets. We've simply gotten better, slowly, at asking it the right questions.